Today, we'll be talking about seed warfare and starvation of civilians in Tigray. And my guest today is David Del Conte. And David has an experience in humanitarian work. Specifically, he has been an independent consultant with over 2 decades of humanitarian experience with the UN and other NGOs. And specifically regarding Ethiopia, 2012-2016, he was the deputy country director for OCHA in the country. In Africa, Middle East, Asia, and Central America, a lot of experience. And currently, he is working full-time, starting maybe next week or May 1st, for Refugees International. David holds degrees in politics and international relations. David, welcome to UMD Media.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. You wrote on the same subject at least 3 times from what I have seen last year. This is co-authored 5 steps the Biden administration needs to take on the crisis in Tigray. That was in February. And then on the Refugees International, you talk about Ethiopians are starving in silence. And on the first year of the war in Tigray last year, you wrote again with Hardin Lang on the same subject matter, famine and civil war. If you go back to November last year, specifically the last week of that, there was a report, Feltman, the US envoy to the Horn of Africa at that time, he mentioned about massive progress made with regard to the diplomatic talks and so on. What happened at that time? Because UMD Media actually was contacted on the same subject from the State Department because they wanted to talk about the massive progress. And that week was also the same Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister, went to the battlefield. What do we know about that week and the weeks that followed that massive progress, David?
Well, thank you. First, that's a very difficult question because I was not in those rooms. I was not making those agreements, and I was not part of the massive progress that did or did not occur. So, unfortunately, I can't speak directly to your question. But within that time frame, the Tigrayan Defense Forces had been marching down the A2 and were getting closer and closer to Addis Ababa. During that time, there was fears that Addis Ababa would be sacked by a combination of TDF forces and Oromo Liberation Front forces. So there's a ton of rumors that have gone around back and forth as to what actually was happening during that window of time, or what progress, what agreements were reached. But the result was that during that time, the government of Ethiopia had obtained significant military advantages with the use of drones as these talks were occurring. And the Tigrayan Defense Forces were caught out into the open. They were physically out in the open and could not be as effective. The choice to return to Tigray or being chased by ENDF forces back to Tigray is not for me as a humanitarian. But during that time, there was a lot of diplomatic efforts being brought to bear to convince the TDF not to invade Addis Ababa. And the OLF was also part of that discussion of not invading Addis Ababa itself and creating war in the capital. But I was not part of those conversations. But during the window of time, the ENDF forces obtained and started using drones for the first time. And during that time, the TDF were in contact with the entirety of Embassy Row. And whether or not they went back to Tigray willingly or unwillingly is not for me to say.
Mm-hmm. I understand, and there is still a lot of unknowns about all this. So maybe talking about the humanitarian aspect of all this. So the siege, the blockade, depending on how we see it, is a multifaceted one. So there is the humanitarian siege, there is the financial, the bank accounts, all that, the transport, communication, and so on. So, what is your understanding of your assessment of where we are now in terms of the blockade compared to where we were, let's say, June last year?
Well, since the blockade came into effect at the end of June last year, whether it's a siege or a blockade is synonyms for me. The reality is that communications are not available to Tigrayans in Tigray. They're not able to call their families or their loved ones. They're not able to inform people if they're alive or if relatives have passed away. The remittances have not been able to get into Tigray, either through mobile banking or through the access to the banks, because both of those are closed off. So people do not have that access and that resource. Trade and commerce has been cut off and denied. So even the private sector just providing access to resources outside of Tigray have remained cut off. And of course, the humanitarian assistance has been 95%, if not more, cut off since the end of June of last year. So whether it's a siege or a blockade is a synonym for me. The blockade, as I term it, has been in effect for a year, and it is a year in June, and it really hasn't moved or changed. The arrival of 20 trucks or the arrival of one aircraft of supplies is nothing compared to the level of need, the amount of need in the Tigray regional state.
And on the refugee issues, the first weeks, maybe some months as well, there were over 60,000 people that made it, to Sudan. But then Western Tigray was cut off, and there are people who actually argue that the European Union, among other actors, international actors, they were okay, at least that is closed, because the refugees in Sudan would have ramifications to what will happen in Europe. So is this a reason why we don't hear a lot from the international community? Maybe the last time we heard from Blinken was the talk of ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray, and Eritrean forces, Amhara force, should be out of Tigray at that time. Then we don't hear a lot. What is your reading of what happens in Western Tigray vis-a-vis the refugee issues?
Well, I think the refugee issue and nationality sovereignty mean that Ethiopia can close its border under international law. It's not illegal to do so. So I'm not sure that your assertion that there's a welcomeness to it, I'm not sure about that. But the camps in Sudan with 65,000 newly arrived, and there were refugees from before in Kadugli and the areas of Sudan. And they're living also in very tough circumstances, but they're safe. The right for Ethiopia to close its border is notwithstanding the plight of the people in Western Tigray and what has occurred in West Tigray since the 4th of November 2020 is something of grave concern to the international community. And as the subject of multiple publications and multiple media exposés that have demonstrated just how awful it has been. And it is one of the core areas that compelled the UN human rights to launch an independent investigation following the joint investigation that was with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. But make no mistake, Tigray is under siege, is facing a blockade, and what has occurred in West Tigray is nothing short of catastrophic and requires independent investigation and independent accountability.
And other humanitarian, I think maybe you can speak to the subject of the difficulty humanitarians have had, still maybe continue to have with regard to advocating and speaking up about the humanitarian situation, but at the same time, not having difficulties, hurdles in their action of or operation on the ground?
Well, I think it's an impossible choice for the UN and for the NGOs in particular, to speak up and speak out against what they see happening in Tigray and in northern Ethiopia overall, for fear of losing their programs on one hand, and that it's important to reference the fact that the humanitarian community is there to provide assistance. And if they speak out and their programs are either suspended or they are kicked out of the country, they can no longer help. So there's on one hand, there's an intense desire to help the people of Tigray. And if they get kicked out, they lose that ability to provide assistance. And on the other is the fact that access is almost down to single digits in terms of commodities of assistance. And even though they can move around the country a bit more safely, they can't provide assistance because it's not available to Tigrayan regional state. So it's a terrible choice, and I say that because I'm on the advocacy side of things. If I was operational agency and I had staff on the ground, I would have a really difficult decision. And let's not forget that there have been staff murdered. MSF lost 3 staff, and there's been no accountability for it at all. And that was 3 weeks after an MSF publication about human rights abuses. So impunity and the safety of staff is a deep, deep concern, not just in Tigray regional state for those with multiple actors on the ground inside regional and inside Tigray, but also around the country. So it's a problem for the NGOs, and I have a great deal of sympathy for them.
In the introduction, I mentioned your experience as the deputy country director for OCHA in Ethiopia, and I'm assuming you have had an experience of definitely being on the side of civilians, those who suffer from famine, all that, and so on. But relatively, maybe it was a different time. It was not war time. So, can you walk us through, what it looked like at that time as an OCHA deputy director and the leader in that team, versus what your colleagues or those who are in your shoes at this time during the past almost 2 years?
Sure. You're correct that it was a different era and a different experience then. In 2012 through 2016, the UN was working with the government of Ethiopia, solving protracted needs, but it was in a time of peace. And yes, there were restraints on humanitarian assistance, and yes, there was difficulties in getting visas or getting staff to be able to be in the country. It was not always easy. But there was peace in the country, and the guiding wisdom at the time was that we would make progress on issues of concern over time, rather than blow the situation up and put millions of people in harm's way by having no assistance reach them. But there's a big difference between delivering humanitarian assistance in a development context that Ethiopia was. There wasn't an active war, so there was an ability to build ministries and departments and work with local government to strengthen their capacity and deliver assistance at the same time. During active conflict, independence, impartiality, and neutrality become critical. And that was very difficult to transition from what was to what is. And that is a difficult jump that I think wasn't fully appreciated by everybody at the start of this war. Humanitarians have a specific skill set, specific trainings, and that's needed in times of active conflict. And those personnel weren't on the ground. And you have to rotate out staff, you have to get people in, you have a different modus operandi of how you work, you have to have a certain separation from parties to the conflict, including, in this case, the government of Ethiopia. But because we were working so closely with the government of Ethiopia for the previous decade and a half, it was difficult to do so. And let's not forget, ultimately, that the government of Ethiopia has the ability to accept or reject the staff that are coming in by not delivering visas. So even when we had the expulsion of UN staff last summer, they haven't been replaced. They haven't been replaced with humanitarians who know how to work in these environments, who know how to position their organizations in these environments. So it's a remarkably difficult place to work today. And for the UN agencies and the NGOs on ground, those who are in Ethiopia, it's a choice between not delivering or continuing to try and muddle through and find ways forward. And for that, I think that there's some decisions that were made that early on, all the way through January of 2021, through to the arrival of the blockade, that put us in a situation where today, 10 months later, less than 5% of relief assistance has reached the people of Tigray that are challenging. And it's not an easy fix. There's no one solution to this. There's no one, like, make that decision and it all gets better. It's a very complex situation. But ultimately, humanitarians must be independent, impartial, and neutral, and operate on the basis of humanity. Those core tenets of humanitarianism really are missing and supremely important when it comes to the work of the aid agencies in Tigray and northern Ethiopia overall.
Is there anything that we can learn from, because Tigray or northern Ethiopia is not the first and unfortunately may not be the last where civilians will be starved and under blockade and so on. So there is a lot of talk about siege warfare in Syria and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So from given your experience internationally in Asia, Middle East, all that, has there been anything like that for this long? The WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros Adhanom, in modern times, he said this is the longest siege. So what is your assessment of this, David?
I think probably the longest siege would be the Great Famine of 1983 to 85. And we saw a blockade then, and we see a blockade now. We saw a blockade in Sri Lanka 2007. We saw a blockade in Yemen. We saw a blockade in South Sudan 2017. But this was actually subject to a UN Security Council resolution that said blockades and siege warfare, the starvation of a population, is a war crime. So the question I think you're asking is about accountability and about responsibility for doing something so awful as to starve women and children and the elderly, to remove access to medicines, to remove access to water, to remove access to simply being able to call your family abroad, to receive assistance via a form of remittances. There has to be accountability for this. And I think that is where the humanitarian community and the international system needs to start moving towards, and saying this is happening in real time, but this is also something that was a known war crime. It was defined as a war crime by the UN Security Council. It was defined as such by the International Criminal Court. So those are the issues that I think that should be on the table.
1984, 85, you mentioned that, but there are accounts from both sides, from the Derg government and the TPLF at that time, mm-hmm. where they made an agreement. Even Mellas was quoted as saying they were able to, the only agreement that held at that time was the passage of humanitarian aid. But talking about accountability, there are people who worry that the international community, from the UN Secretary General to the US, anyone in between, they were quick to congratulate, to celebrate when there is any move, including the 20 trucks and so on. But then suddenly, relatively, keep quiet, or maybe maximum say, express their concerns. Do you see there is that element of not speaking up about accountability that might have aggravated the situation?
I think that it is important to celebrate progress, however incremental it might be. I think it's important to acknowledge when there have been breakthroughs, however small they may have been. But I think it's equally important to finish that sentence with two more. We welcome 20 trucks, but 80 were needed today. We welcome an aircraft full of humanitarian supplies, but one aircraft is equal to one truck. What we need is 100 trucks per day. So while we welcome 20, we need 80. And that is what I think is missing in terms of contextualizing the progress that there has been. I think it's important to acknowledge progress, but given the state of the blockade and the absence of relief assistance, absence of any relief, I think it is owed, and it is owed to the people of Tigray to finish the paragraph, such as it is.
Great. Feldman came and went or gone, and then David Satterfield seems to be following the same footstep. What is your reading of what's happening in this, where these experienced senior diplomats come and go without maybe moving the needle, so to speak, at least in the humanitarian terms?
Well, yes, I think the United States has struggled to have a firm and clear policy as to what it wants to do in Ethiopia, where you had Feltman come in and then you had his replacement also, both, as you say, exit. I think it's important for this administration to take a firm and clear line and implement it over time. And I think that's the challenge that the U.S. administration faces. Having crises elsewhere in the world, including in Ukraine, should not detract or deter a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. And certainly, I think we all can chew and walk and chew gum, as they say. So I think as a challenge is to get a steady hand and follow through with all of this over time, to marshal the efforts of the European Union, which have also been stop-start, to make sure that all members of the European Union have the same view and the reasons why. And there are certain countries in Europe that are not as strong as others, and that needs to be shored up. If you look at the African Union and what they can or cannot do, it needs to be understood and appreciated, and use those good offices for what they can do rather than deride what they cannot. The African Union's own bylaws prevent it from intervening in a member state of the African Union. So to ask them to do so is unfair and unreasonable. But they can play an important role, and I think they need to be brought onto the table and help where they can actually help. And emergent important governments are like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia all have a role to play because they have political and economic stakes in Ethiopia. So getting them to understand their role in all this is certainly very, very important. And last but not least, I think we have to acknowledge that Russia plays a role and China plays a role, and advocacy with them, understanding their role in history, what happens after this for China, for Russia, and for all supporters of Ethiopia's people, not just one government. I think there's a necessary advocacy and understanding that needs to be done on that side.
Actually, that leads me to my final question for the day, and it may be a very long question, but you kind of addressed this somehow. So if you were to speak to, Abiy Ahmed directly, Debretsion directly, and then, of course, the UN Secretary General and the US government. I'm just identifying these four as main, but you alluded to the fact that there are many actors in the region, understandably. So what would David tell them, specifically again from breaking the blockade and getting full unfettered access to humanitarian aid? If you were to speak to them directly, what would you ask them to do, each of these actors?
Well, to the government of Ethiopia, very specifically, to remove the blockade and to allow assistance to flow unfettered. And if there is a need for international monitors, bring international monitors. But to continue this war crime only hurts the people of Ethiopia. It hurts the government of Ethiopia. It hurts the future of the country, economically, politically, socially. The first thing towards peace and reconciliation, the first thing towards a national reconciliation is allowing people not to starve to death. That would be my first request to Mekonnen or Abiy or the rest of the Prosperity Party. If you want to have a future, you have to bring everyone together. And isolating and starving one people is not a demonstration of that. I think the UN Secretary General ought to fly to Ethiopia. I think he ought to fly to Tigray, and I think he ought to see it firsthand, rather than not go over the last 2 years. I think he should be there. He should understand it himself and go back with the moral outrage that the rest of us feel. And within that, sit with the leaders, all stakeholders, and make a push for peace. Understand that this happens during his tenure, his legacy. And with the U.S. government and the U.S. administration, I would ask them to have a clear policy spelled out within the next 30 days as to what they want to do and how they're going to go about doing it in Ethiopia, with Eritrea, and with the very possibility of a collapsed Ethiopia in the future, should they not find a way towards peace soon. We have to put Tigray in the context of the Horn of Africa drought. We have to put Tigray and Ethiopia in the wider context of a food price crisis that this world has never seen, that a fuel price crisis this world has never seen, and the absence of support for the country. It's really only the United States stepping up in meaningful ways to fund humanitarian efforts. The UAE has been important. Europe has been important, of course. But we're talking about $1 billion, and there's a need to really get forward on this. So it is important for the US to use its strength and its leverage. It's important for this administration to find a way towards peace with all parties to the conflict before the country starts to really fall apart, and all those systems and structures that we spent decades supporting. The people of Ethiopia, we spent decades supporting, before that's lost. That's what I would say.
And to Debrecen, to Tigray?
I think that more than anything, the steps he took to withdraw from Amhara to withdraw from Afar is important, but he needs to put a dedicated position on West Tigray as something that needs to be solved and adjudicated outside of war to allow for peace to return to the country, and seek solutions through an international body as to the future of West Tigray. And that means he stays out and allows Eritrea and Amhara militias to leave West Tigray to be governed until such a time as there is a determination. But for the sake of the people of Tigray itself, he needs to allow for what conditions have been placed to adhere to them. But he also needs to demand that West Tigray be solved by non-violent means. Ultimately, there is no winner in this war. There is no good guy, because war does not produce good guys. It produces a whole bunch of suffering. So that's what I would say.
Great, David. Before we leave, maybe as OCHA, the peace director, you must have been to northern Ethiopia, including Tigray.
Yes.
And if you were to talk to the farmer in Tigray, the woman, the children in Tigray, what would that be as a humanitarian who worked there before?
In the past, when I went all the way up to Aksum and to Shire, and then I went through Kobo, and I went through Gondor, and I went through Sekota and Wag Himra. Because I'm an outsider, it's very difficult for me to tell where I am. I was driving in a car and we went for hours and hours. But when we stopped, and I would look and I would talk to people about what their hopes were, what their aspirations were, what they wanted to do with their lives and the lives of their children, and I would want to listen to them. And never did I hear, I want to go to war. I want to lose everything I have. I want to lose my family. I want to lose my future, my hope, my opportunity. I never heard that once. So if I was there then, and knowing that they just wanted it to get a little better, to get a well, to get a school, to get a different economic opportunity for their children. Today, I would be trying to find out what they needed to get through this day and how they could instill a little bit of hope into their children's lives so that there was an opportunity to rebuild in the future. And if I was there today, I would just be incredibly sad to not be able to help. The people of Kobo are no different than the people across in Tigray. The people of Waghemara are no different than the people across in Tigray. They're all the same. They're just trying to improve their lives and get their families into a better situation. And hopefully for Ethiopia, they can start dismantling the hate speech that's been going on, start dismantling this joy about the suffering of others, and start concentrating on taking care of one's own, taking care of one's community, taking care of one's areas, and start looking for peaceful solutions for everyone around them, whether they're Tigrayan or Amharan or Afari. None of those groups won this war, and I think that there's a little bit lost in the fog of war. But for the people of northern Ethiopia, and especially, I must say, especially the people of Tigray, they have suffered mightily as a result of this war. And when we talk about Tigray, it's a famine. It's not hungry. It's not, I haven't eaten in a week. It's famine, and that's different. If you're in a hospital and one person has a need for open heart surgery, they get priority over the person with a broken leg. And we need to prioritize famine and famine response in Tigray while still acknowledging the critical importance to assist those in Amhara and Afar. It's not morally awkward. It's not morally awkward at all. The people of Tigray are experiencing famine. And the people of Amhara and Afar are experiencing significant and severe food shortages. All three must be addressed. But the first thing that has to happen is the takedown of the blockade and unfettered assistance to all that need it. But that has not been the case, sir.
Great, thank you, David Del Conte. He was the deputy director of OCHA in Ethiopia between 2012 to 2016, and he's joining Refugees International full-time starting May 1st. David, thank you for your time and for your insight today.
Pleasure.
You have been following us live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and my conversation with David Del Conte on siege warfare and starvation of civilians in Tigray is over. Thank you for following us. Please subscribe, like, and share our show so that many can access this material. Yosef Gebrehevot will be back tomorrow with his new weekly show, In Depth with Yosef G. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about the International Crisis Group and its stance on Tigray. So please, tomorrow, tune in to Yosef's weekly show, In Depth with Yosef G. Thank you. Bye from here.